So today we're going to take a look at SQL Azure and how that can be edited with a Breeze WebAPI and an AngularJS front end. So there's kind of three components, and what we're going to start with is a SQL database on the back. We're going to put a web API in the middle, which is made with Breeze. And then finally we're going to have an AngularJS on the front end. Now this entire thing could be repeated in the cloud, in which case we would end up with SQL Azure and a Azure website for hosting the API portion. And then finally we'd probably actually put this over in Office 365 with SharePoint Online as a content editor hosting the front end. So three components: Angular to Breeze to SQL, and we'll look at developing locally first because technologies are basically the same, but then publishing to the cloud by using everything on the bottom here of SQL Azure, Azure Website, and SharePoint Online. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is our storage, which is a SQL engine. We'll go over here. We have a database called To-Do List, a single table called To-Do with 3 columns: identity, a text description, and then Boolean, is it done, true or false. And I went ahead and put in 2 test rows, and we got some data populated. This is all running SQL Express locally. Now we want to take a look at Visual Studio and spinning up an empty website. We're going to call this To-Do API. This is going to be our Web API middle tier going between the database on the back and JavaScript on the front. We're making an empty website with nothing in it. That was successful, so let's go ahead and delete the web config file. And now we're left with a pretty Spartan project. Doesn't have a whole lot in it. Now our project is going to be connected to SQL for Entity Framework. So what we can do here is right click and go to Add Entity Data Model. Go ahead and give this a name. I'm going to prefix most things with the word to do and then use the system name beyond that. Connection string is going to be local, and we use Windows authentication, verify, hit OK, Entity Framework 6. Do not pluralize. That adds an S at the end of the nouns. I find that confusing, so I avoid the plural checkbox. So now we see the design canvas for the Entity Framework model. Just click on the background somewhere and hit F4. There's a namespace property. I like this to match my .NET namespace, so we'll change that so that it matches what we have for the project overall, the namespace value here. We'll hit save. So with that part done, we're going to pop open the Package Manager console and do a few NuGet packages. The first one's going to be install package Breeze WebAPI 2 EF6. Next, we're going to load a package for newtonsoft.json. Okay, then we're going to load a package for WebAPI OData. And finally, we're going to add a package for WebAPI.cores. Okay, with all those packages added, we're going to hit Control-Shift-B to build. It says build succeeded. That's a very nice place to begin. So at this point, we're going to throw away the scripts folder. It has a few client-side things we're not really going to need because the focus here is on the server backend API. We'll do right-click, add new item. On this dialog, we're going to choose the Web API Controller 2. And I'm going to name it after the project, To-Do API Controller. That gives us a little bit of a template, and we're going to delete everything with that public class and bring it down to just the namespace. And here I'm going to paste in some template code for a Breeze controller. I'm going to take out the word authorize because we're not using Windows authentication here. And we'll make sure that name matches correctly. It's going to be To-Do API Controller. And our entities are actually going to be to-do list entities to match the name of our entity framework that we brought in over here. And metadata, that actually stays the same for all of them. Okay, now here we get into entities. The schema that we're working with today has a single entity called to-do. So I'm going to go ahead and update that in 3 places. And at this point, we've got a little red squiggly going on with IntelliSense. So we'll do some using statements. better define what libraries we have a dependency on. Yep, get all those in. Looks great. Let's build it. Okay, build succeeded. So we have our controller. Now over here in the app start area, we actually want to add one more statement. This is going to be for enabling cores. Go ahead and put that down here. Cores, paste that in, and yeah. Excellent. So our project builds successfully. We have enabled cores. We have a single controller with all the Breeze decorations that points back to to-do list entities. This all looks pretty good. Yeah, let's play it and see if we can get some JSON data. So here we have the /Breeze/to-do API, which is the name of our controller. You can see the match there for to-do API. And we're bringing in the metadata suffix, which tells us everything about string, boolean, int32. These are all the field names going back to SQL. So very descriptive with the schema. It also understands foreign keys, primary keys, one-to-many relationships. This is an easy example with one table. If you had 10 tables, it would populate all of that. Absolutely fantastic. So any framework is sort of understanding the SQL schema into .NET, and then Breeze is taking that .NET concept and pushing it forward as JSON. Let's go ahead and change the suffix here to the word to do, and here we actually get to see our data from our SQL table. And in fact, if we wanted to, we can go ahead and do right-click, edit top, put in a new item here. So we have a third row in our database, hit F5, and there we go. We see our third row. So that's a live test, change the data, reload, and we're seeing the data come through. So that looks great. That's our API up and running locally. We're going to do one more thing for security. Okay, now for security, I'm going to add a fixed header that is required to interact with this API. And I'm going to call it to-do key. So you think about API keys that things like Google give us as developers. We're going to do something similar here. And go ahead and define to-do key. And then within our methods, we're going to say HTTP context. Up here on the using statements, we're going to add system.web. And then down here, we're going to add .current request headers. We're going to look for to-do key. Now, if we have that key, then we'll proceed. And if the key exactly equals the value we want, then we'll execute the real Breeze method. So what we're setting up here is that the key has to exist and have the correct value to run code. Otherwise, we're going to kick back null. So by wrapping the functional statement with some conditions, we're now making it a little bit harder for that to actually happen. So the only way to interact with this API would be to put the key as a header on all the traffic you're sending. When we're hosting things on the internet, we'll be careful about security. We don't want to just have an API sitting out there listening anonymously without any security around it. So go ahead and put that together, and let's play the project. So here we are on the same URL as before, going to Breeze to do API metadata. However, we just see the word null. It's actually not providing a response at all, which is our security measure. Now if we came over here to Fiddler, we did a compose, execute, inspect, we see that same thing. But if we go to the composer and we add the key, we should get a different result. So we're going to add to-do key, hit execute, go inspect the value, and now we're seeing all of the data come back. Even better if we were to change this to the name of a single table, getting rid of the metadata ending and hit execute. Yeah, now we see our 3 records from the database. So having that key is what allows the API to respond. We've now wrapped all of the functional code with a condition to make it more secure. That pretty much wraps up our API. Let's go ahead and look at the front end. Now, to do our work on the front end, we're going to make a new folder. We're going to call it To-Do Spot for single page application. And we'll go in there, and there's no contents. We're going to go ahead and get npm started. And there's a couple things that we'd like to do here. We're also going to go ahead and get TSC started, which is the TypeScript compiler. And for the sake of TypeScript, I want to install the Angular typing so that we get a little bit of IntelliSense. Nice. And on the npm side, we are going to install Angular, which we're going to need for the client-side library, angular.js. This is all Angular 1 right here. Breeze client. That'll give us the Breeze Angular bridge, which connects the two together. We're also going to install jQuery. And we're going to install Q. And finally, we're going to install Toaster for notifications. So with all of that installed, let's fire up VS Code. And we see a folder tree that's pretty well populated. A lot of kind of default boilerplate. We're going to add a to-do HTML file and a to-do JS file. The HTML file we're going to spec out with a little bit of the HTML file we're going to spec out with a little boilerplate using Zen coding, which is the now called Emmet, but it's things like div, ul, li, expand, does all that cool stuff with the tags for us. That's going to be a lot of what we need to do to go ahead and get a kind of a presentation or a look put together. So, we'll do some returns and headings and things like that. We'll come back and fill this in a little bit more, but we're trying to do a bulleted list. And, of course up here in the header, we're going to need to add a handful of script tags for our library. Okay, so now I've added a bunch of script tags for libraries that we're going to be using. Down here, we're going to go ahead and define our Angular application, and we're going to have one controller here. Nothing too fancy with routes and all that, just one controller. And we're going to put the word hello here. And over on this side, we're going to spec out our Angular controller. So we're going to make a very simple controller. We're going to name this To-Do App. No dependencies at the moment. To-Do controller. Go ahead and define all that. Great. Looks pretty good. Over here we have our project. I'm going to kick off Browser Sync. This is a cool utility that lets you get a live preview of your work. So over here we've got to-do HTML. Yeah, we got hello world. Change that to test and hit save. Changes it to test over there. Very nice. So that's just a real quick kind of sanity check to make sure that the Angular controller is loading successfully, that Angular is attached, and then at that point we're in a spot where we're better off to go ahead and start working through our other changes. I'll open up the console at the bottom, seeing a little bit of 404, so I may need to double check. Yeah, it's a build folder for Toaster here, so that's going to be like that. There we go, no more 404s. Cool. So from here we're going to look at adding the Breeze library to our Angular module and connecting it up so that we can get live data. Okay, so here with our Angular controller, we're going to add breeze.angular as a dependency and save. I'll module breeze.angular is not available. Okay, getting a little error message. Breeze AngularJS. Nope, it has a different name. Breeze.bridge.angular. Bridge. There we go. Much better. Cool. So one of the things we're going to put in our controller is a reference over to the URL. So in order for Breeze to work happily, we have this idea of a manager, which is kind of like entity framework in JavaScript. I mean, really that's the whole idea of Breeze. But we're going to open up an entity manager. We're going to give it the URL that we were working with earlier. So like our little metadata address here. Very nice. But you leave off the metadata suffix when you're doing this. It already knows about that part. So that will create a connection and allow us to learn a little bit more about the data. So now when we load our spa, we should see some traffic. Okay. It's not running any queries against it. New Breeze entity management to do API. Right, and I think if this is still up and active, yep, cool, perfect. All right, and so from here we're going to add a few more methods. We want to add a refresh method that will load data when the controller initializes, as well as if there's any major changes. We want to add a method for adding an item. We want one for deleting an item. And we finally want one for saving. And that will basically take care of the CRUD operations for this application. Alright, so now I've created basic functions for each, just empty function stubs. And here we're going to make a query going to our breeze.entityQuery object. And we're going to read this from to-do as the table. And we're going to be using vm.manager. When we execute this query, we're going to have a callback function. There's our callback. Now, inside of the callback, this is the success callback, we're going to go ahead and assign the to-dos collection and give it the value of results. Now, if it was not successful, we've got another function for error handling, and we're going to console log that error so at least we can see it for troubleshooting. Now, when we are adding an item, we need to have some default values, and that's going to be a singleton object. And here we're going to have whatever the new to-do expression is, and we're going to have the word done, but really just as a Boolean true-false. And then the way we implement that with Breeze is called create entity. Tell it the name of the table we're putting it in, we give it the values, and then we basically have it go save. Now, in this case, we're going to empty out whatever that new to-do value was that was used for the names in order to get ready for the next pass. On delete, we need to take in an object to know which object it is we're deleting. And on that, we're going to grab the entity aspect, and we are going to set it deleted. And finally, vm.save. So add an item, put in the default values, create entity, save. Delete, grab that current object, mark it as deleted, and go run save. And refresh will download the data to attach it to the view model. The other thing we want to do here is a $apply to force a refresh. So down here in save, we're going to do vm.manager save changes. And we are going to follow that up with a function, so do a promise aware here, to go ahead and do a refresh and to essentially redraw the screen. Make sure we save our data, but then refresh what people are seeing. And finally, when this whole controller wakes up, initializes, we want to call vm.refresh when it first opens as a way of fetching data. Now, all that looks pretty good for the CRUD operations. Over here, we're seeing an error. Cannot read property schema of null. When we look at our network and look at the metadata line, we can see the response is the word null. Now, where is that coming from? It's our security stuff. We don't have a header in here. It's trying. It's actually trying to get the data, but it's not working because it's missing the security header. So one thing we need to do for our security header on our API is to add in some code which will populate a default header. Now, the code for that looks a little bit like this, where we get the adapter instance of Ajax, we change the default settings, we give it a collection of headers, and here we're going to have to-do key, and that's going to equal whatever the value was we had over here in Visual Studio. Very nice. With our security header in place, we're going to take a look at the view and how to go ahead and lay out those repeating bullets. So here I've got ng repeat t to-dos. We're going to do a checkbox. We're going to add a text field, and finally a button. There we go. The button is going to be to delete the current item. Nice. The text field we actually need to bind, so that's going to be two-way binding, ng model to t.name. Very cool. We see the name showing up. I like it. ng model equals t.done, whether something's complete or not. And those are kind of the basics. Now down here we're going to add a little bit more with a form that will add a new item. Okay, so here I added a form at the bottom which will submit to the add function, has a text called new to do, and a save button which will go execute that method. So the idea now, if we have first, second, third, let's do hello world test, save, and we'll come over to SQL, select, and we're seeing our data change. That's really cool. Now if I check a couple of boxes and hit save, I see that done is now toggled to true, or 1, for the bottom two items. So this is actually live and connected. Now if I delete world and hit save, I just see hello and test. Wow, that's really cool. So if I do more, add and save, reload here, there's my more item. So we just did all 4 CRUD operations. We add a new item, read, update, delete. Yeah, we covered all 4 of the major CRUD operations. So we're changing a SQL database from JavaScript. We're all running on localhost. Browser sync is refreshing here, so as I make changes, we can, kind of see things happening in the browser while we're working on our code on this side. But there's not that much to it. I mean, there's a controller with the 4 CRUD operations. We are using Breeze's entity query to get a rich object. We're not treating it as flat JSON, but as Breeze objects. That allows us to do things like create entity, which is schema aware, and to mark as deleted and then save changes all at once. It's kind of subtle, but there's some batching that happens. Like you could delete an item, add an item, change an item, hit save for all of that, and the whole thing gets batched in one transaction over the wire. So there's a lot of benefits to performance, user experience, mobile connections, and using something like this. Putting the header down here globally is part of our security, so that all of the network traffic that the application emits is going to include that header. Here you can see the save changes transaction with the to-do key, and over here is one to fetch data with the to-do key. So our WebAPI backend is receiving and validating that header. The application is putting it on all of its traffic. Throw away this test line, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the application's up, running, works great. Now, what I'd like to look at later is how to publish this to the cloud. But right now we have a working local application with WebAPI, Breeze, and Angular, including a security HTTP header. Thanks for watching.